I am James Ray from the Government Department. I wanted to take a moment to introduce a little information about the Nobel Peace Prize and how we're trying to connect it to our campus before I introduce the featured speaker. The Dean of College of Social Sciences, Ern Bodvarsson, last year initiated a task force to try to bring the Nobel Peace Prize to our campus through a vehicle called the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, which is a non-profit, non-governmental organization based in Minnesota that hosts Nobel Peace Prize laureates, typically in the year after their awarding. And last year, he funded a few faculty and a few students to attend that forum, and he has pledged that he will also fund a few faculty and a few students in the coming year. And that forum will be held in June of 2016. And here in front, perhaps at the end of the talk, you can come up and grab an application. And that application is not due until March, but you could begin to think about it, identify a faculty recommender, begin to write your 2-page essay, and you might be one of the students then selected to attend that event. And we have alumni of that event here in front of us. And so I just wanted to share that information. That's a wonderful opportunity for students here. Otherwise, let me turn my attention then to the talk for today. And I'd like to introduce Professor David Andersen-Rodgers, who is also Associate Professor of Government and focused with a concentration in international relations. He has a background in peace and security studies and did his undergraduate work at Hampshire College and subsequently completed his PhD at the University of Maryland in international relations. Along the way, he worked for nonprofit groups that focused on peace and security, like the Federation of American Scientists and Student Pugwash USA. And today, he's going to share with us his expertise in a talk entitled "The Power of Norms, the Impact of the Nobel Peace Prize on Global Politics." And this talk is kind of quadruple supported by the College of Social Sciences, by the Nobel Peace Prize Forum Steering Committee, Peace and Conflict International, and the One World Initiative. And I'd like to mention that Professor Andersen-Rodgers also administers our Peace and Conflict Resolution minor, if any students interested in joining that minor, as well as faculty advisor for the Peace and Conflict International Club, which might be a vehicle for you to become more familiar with these international issues of peace and conflict. And so otherwise, I would like to give the floor to Professor Andersen-Rodgers and say that he has guaranteed to me he will predict accurately the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and that we can go up to Reno and put money in the casinos. I'm sure they have it on the big board. And he's going to talk all about the influence of norms and the Nobel Peace Prize. So if you can all welcome Professor Andersen-Rodgers.
Thank you very, very much, James, and thank you everyone for coming out and joining me here today. The one thing I would like to do before I start is give a little plug for the One World Initiative here on campus. The One World Initiative sponsors a number of events just like this one, and if you want to get on the mailing list to be informed of upcoming events here on campus, this year the theme is power, and we're exploring different interdisciplinary and global perspectives on power. So here's this, and you can, one of you would like to grab it. Oh, great. Wonderful. Okay. Let me just get my notes out. So I'd like to, before I start, give a quick background into why I got interested in the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize for me has always been sort of ever since I was a little kid, whenever it was announced, it was kind of this exciting moment where someone in the world was being recognized for the work that they were doing in the field of peace. And, but lately it's turned into a bit of an academic hobby, I think you can say. And so we have, here's another. So first I'd like to give you, once, this is just to show that I used to have hair. But this is a picture of me with Joseph Rotblat, who's on the right of the picture. He was the recipient of the 1995 Nobel Peace Prize, along with the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. The Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs was a group of scientists, mostly Soviet scientists and American scientists, but scientists from all over the world, who worked on nuclear disarmament issues. And I had the privilege to start to get involved with the student branch of the Pugwash Conferences of Science and World Affairs when I was a college student, and I later on went to go work for the organization. Well, just before I started working there, they were announced as the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize, and that meant that I got to spend, the next few years of my life cavorting with Joseph Rotblat and traveling to different places around the world. This picture is actually taken at the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, which Professor Ray was just talking about. You have the opportunity of going in I think it would have been 1996 when we were there. So having that experience to be able to be part of a Nobel Prize-winning organization and spending time with Nobel laureates. And just a little background, Professor Rotblat was the oldest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. He was 87 years old when he received it. And he was the only Manhattan Project nuclear scientist to leave the project for moral reasons. When it became known that the Nazis were not going to successfully develop a nuclear weapon, his family was killed in the Holocaust. And when he learned that that was not going to be a possibility, he stepped back from the project and resigned his position with the project, and then later went on to found the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs with Albert Einstein. And I believe also in the audience, has Bill Durston arrived yet? Well, he has. It doesn't look like he's here yet, but he's planning on being here. And he's the local chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which was the U.S. affiliate of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. They have a very active local chapter. And so if you're also interested in getting involved in some capacity with a Nobel Peace Prize receiving organization, I highly recommend looking into the activities that the Physicians for Social Responsibility are doing. Okay, so that's my background and sort of the beginning of how I got interested in the prize. Now, as most of you know, there'll be stuff up there in a second. As most of you know, the Nobel Peace Prize is named in honor of Albert Nobel, who gave part of his fortune to funding prizes for the achievements in sciences and literature, and also, as you know, the Peace Prize. And now, does anyone know how Alfred Nobel made his money? What's that? Dynamite, right? TNT. He made his fortunes by building very large factories that created munitions that were used in wartime. So there's this bit of irony that Nobel is associated with the Peace Prize. In fact, there's an early quote when he was talking with Bertha von Suttner, a novelist, where he said, "My factories may end war sooner than your Congresses. The day when two army corps will be able to destroy each other in 1 second, all civilized nations will recoil from war and whore and disband their armies." His belief that is the more terrible you made your munitions, right, the more likely people would step back from war. Well, yes, and he had, through a series of correspondences, particularly with Bertha von Suttner, he actually stepped back away from these positions. And in his will, just before he died, he wrote, "The Peace Prize will go to the person who shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace congresses." And that's what it says in his will. That on who is deserving of that prize. And a lot of this changed from his reliance on munitions as sort of a means towards peace to one in which he was putting his name on this universal prize to promote peace. Part of it was due to these correspondences with von Suttner, but also a love of the poet Shelley, who was a pacifist as well. Now, who gives out the Peace Prize? Actually, does anyone know? What country does the Peace Prize come from? It's now on the slide, so it should be fairly easy. How many of you, we'll do it in a different way. How many of you thought Sweden? Right? Okay, very good. Sweden gives out all the Nobel Prizes except for one. Norway is the country where the Nobel Peace Prize comes from. And now, how did this happen? When the Nobel Peace Prize, when Nobel was designating who would give out these peace prizes, the Norway and Sweden were in a union together, with Sweden being the dominant power within that union. And so there's some belief that the reason why he gave it to the Norwegian parliament, known as the Storting, was that he didn't want the prize to be linked to sort of Swedish power. That the weaker Storting in Norway would, who had also been very involved in the interparliamentary unions in Europe, that would give the prize more legitimacy coming from the weaker institution within that union. Now, Norway achieved its independence in 1905. That was 4 years after the first prize was given out. Now, if you think about the temptation, right? You're a small, newly independent state, just free from being in this joint union with a more powerful state, and you have this prize, where you can every year come out and say, this is the person or the organization that's been working for peace. That's a tremendous amount of leverage for a small power to have. And when we start looking at the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, Norway began to use that leverage. Now, it used to be made up of members who served in the Norwegian government, and I'll talk a little bit later about how that's changed. The prize is still announced in Oslo. The Nobel Committee is still made up of Norwegian nationals, but none of those Norwegian nationals are current members of the Norwegian government. And there's a very good reason for that. Now you're not the only one to think that maybe the Nobel Prize came out of Sweden. Even the New York Times, when it was announcing that Wilson was going to get the prize, highlighted Sweden in their announcement. Wilson, though, and the reason why I put this up as well to look at, is that when Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919, this was the first time it was ever on the front page of the New York Times. So there'd been, they had skipped a few years during World War I, but there'd been prizes being given out since 1901. And the New York Times, the paper of record, right, had not seen up to this point any reason to put it on the front page. So in 1919, we see Woodrow Wilson get the Nobel Peace Prize, and we see it make the front page news. Tomorrow, when it's announced, it's going to be announced tomorrow morning, if you have any news alerts, it's probably going to pop up on your news alert on your smartphones. So the prize has taken a lot larger presence in our global thinking. So let's think about Norway a little bit, and just think about what about Norway might influence the type of people, the type of organizations that would receive the prize. So here is a map of Norway. One of the things that is very evident about this map is that there's a lot of coast along Norway. And just to the other side of that coast down here, you see what country? Great Britain, a very large naval power. And to the east, you have, well, Sweden and Finland, but then you also have Russia. So if you think about geopolitics for a second, and you think about the great power of Russia, and one of the things it's always desired, which is seaports that give it access to the Atlantic Ocean, Scandinavia looks very, very, very tempting to that kind of global power. Great Britain, with its navy and with its power, would see Norway as something that it would want to remain independent as much as possible. So being as geographically remote as it was, but having such important geopolitical positioning, there was a lot of interest in keeping Norway free. And so Great Britain certainly had an interest in keeping Norway a free and independent state. So Norway has been very involved in NATO, but it's not an EU member. Its foreign policy has always been a combination of pragmatic realism and what we would refer to as idealism. That promotes what is known as liberal internationalist norms, meaning respect for human rights, respect for sovereignty, the promotion of international organizations, and but also, anyways, I'll leave it at that. All right, so what I want to propose is that when we're thinking about the Nobel Peace Prize, right, it fits within this framework of norms promotion, that the Nobel Committee is interested in promoting very specific norms. The Nobel Peace Prize has a strategic purpose for the Nobel Committee. It wants the prize to focus on a norm that it sees as vital to global peace. And so this is, I'm not going to get into this large chart right now, but when we think about norms and how they emerge in the international system, first it begins with norm entrepreneurs saying, hey, you know what? We should respect human rights, right? Or we should promote international cooperation, or we should try to get rid of the most egregious weapons of war. And once those norm entrepreneurs start making that argument, we start to see what's referred to by Finnemore and Sikkink as a norm cascade. States start to adopt that norm. You know, a powerful state might say, yeah, you're right, we should be promoting human rights, or we should be putting limits on certain types of weapons. And international organizations start to adopt those norms, and different transnational networks start to emerge to promote those norms. And once they get promoted, they become internalized. They become parts of states' foreign policies. They become parts of international organizations. The transnational advocacy networks become professionalized in continuing to advocate and promote a certain set of norms. Now, and so what I argue is that the Nobel Peace Prize really fits within stage 2. It's rare that you sort of see the Nobel laureate being so unknown and their cause so unknown. That doesn't typically happen, that they're at the very first stages of norm promotion. Where you're most likely to see the Nobel Peace Prize be selected is in the second stage, when a norm's starting to gain traction, and that the Nobel Peace Prize works as this mechanism to really highlight it, to really kind of bring it out into the larger political discourse. So my argument is that the prize choice will be a strategic choice focused on a very important key issue to the Nobel Committee. And so to be able to predict the prize, which I will do tonight, I've never been correct, but I'm going to get it today, right? in order to predict that prize, what you need to understand is, one, how Norway thinks about the world. Even though it's not Norway giving out the prize now, it's the Norwegian Nobel Committee. But thinking about how someone from that country who's been, discoursed in Norwegian foreign policy might think about sort of the larger global good. And then what are the main key issues that have arisen that year in global politics? So now, so what we're looking at is a strategic choice where that are going to be reflective of the national interests of a small power. And particularly early on in the history of the prize, and now you could say it's going to be reflective of the interests of a important actor in a larger transnational movement. And so the prize is often seen as a means of reward and punishment, either for good behavior or for bad behavior, or it's also used as a way to highlight the mechanisms and the institutions that the Norwegian Nobel Committee sees as an important agent in promoting a specific set of norms. And so that discourse will then lead to this increased amount, will hopefully lead to increased norm cascade. Now the question is, does it work? I don't know. That's my problem. I've been trying to figure out a way to definitively show that when the prize is announced, then discourse in the world changes positively towards that. And I think in some ways there's some evidence that it does. In other ways, there's not a lot of evidence in the other direction. So, but regardless of whether it works or not, it does have an effect of increasing discourse around that prize. So let's talk about the types of prizes that are often given out. Arms control and disarmament. Now this is a list of 7 categories that you can find on the Nobel website. And so this is how they designate the different types of categories for the prize. Arms control and disarmament has had 19 prizes. Human rights has had 25 prizes. And some of these, they have it listed double. So someone might get the prize and they list it under negotiation and human rights. So there's more prizes than, there's more numbers here listed than there were actual prizes. So 24 have received it in humanitarian work, 33 for negotiation, oftentimes the most controversial prize, right? Because who negotiates conflicts? People who are fighting wars. And so then you get, Henry Kissinger will get a Nobel Peace Prize, right? Et cetera. Peace movements, more prizes have gone to the peace movement, people who are part of peace movements. Now, part of the reason for that was that early in the history, the prize almost went exclusively to these people. People who are involved in peace organizations in Europe, and they would receive the prize. They were not very well known before the prize. They remained fairly unknown after the prize as well, unless you were also working within that peace movement itself. Women's rights, 3 people have received the prize for that, all in the same year in 2011. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Lema Bowie, and Tawakkol Karman. And World Organizing has received the prize 26 times. Now, World Organizing, right, these are the prizes that go to such organizations like UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, or the United Nations Peacekeeping. The European Union received the prize a few years ago. So those are what are seen as world organizing organizations. Now, let's talk about some of the prizes, right? And some of these types of prizes. Now, 3 of these images probably seem familiar to you. One probably not, but let's talk about each one. The upper left corner, right, that's Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. Now, if you're good in American and you've taken all your American history courses, it probably, if anything, glanced over the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. When we learn about Teddy Roosevelt, we learn about the Rough Riders, we learn about speaking softly but carrying a big stick, sort of a reputation that you would think doesn't necessarily merit the Nobel Peace Prize. But he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Now, at the time, this was a very controversial prize. It was controversial, one, because if you think back to the will of Nobel, this idea of giving a prize for someone carrying out this very specific act of peace was not necessarily obvious in Nobel's will. Now, the other side of the controversy was, what year did he win the prize? In 1906, if you remember earlier in my talk. When did Norway receive its independence from Sweden? 1905. This is a clear first example of Norway saying, we're a small independent power. We're a very weak independent power. Who might be helpful to us? Well, perhaps the President of the United States, a growing, emerging power, a president who's showing U.S. Power around the world. And so in the histories of the Nobel Peace Prize, it's very clear that the Nobel Committee at that time was thinking strategically about their alliances. And doing something favorable for Teddy Roosevelt by giving him this honor was an important part of that foreign policy early on. Now, the interesting thing about the prize was that after he received the prize, Teddy Roosevelt loved it. He absolutely loved having the prize. And every time he tried to unsuccessfully run for president in the future, he would use the Nobel Peace Prize as evidence that he isn't this big bully running around the world, but he's a man of peace. And so he really, out of anyone who received the prize early on in its history, he was the greatest promoter of the Peace Prize himself. Now, if we go down to the left, does anyone know who that is? I didn't either before I started researching the Nobel Peace Prize. This is Karl von Ossietzky. He was a German who was the person who revealed that the Nazis were rearming. And he was a journalist who started to reveal that the Nazis were rearming, and so the Nazis threw him in jail. And so when he was thrown in jail, and he was a political prisoner in these Nazi jails, there was a very strong social movement to try to get him the Nobel Peace Prize, because they felt that if they highlighted the plight that he was going through under the Nazi regime, that this would show that that what was happening in Nazi Germany was contrary to the liberal ideals that the rest of Europe, or much of the rest of Europe, was trying to promote. So he was given the prize in 1935, and when he received the prize, Hitler was furious. He quickly announced a new set of Nobel Prizes. They didn't call them Nobel Prizes, but prizes that then Germany would give out, and declared that no other German would ever, forever be allowed to receive a Nobel Prize in any category. There's evidence that after the Nazi Germany invaded and occupied Norway in 1940, that they then sought out people who were responsible for the awarding of that prize to von Ossietzky. It was one of the first clear examples of the Nobel Committee trying to put pressure on a government by recognizing with the Nobel Peace Prize a dissident in that country. The backlash, obviously, well, they got invaded, right? I don't know if that's not a direct backlash, but it happened. But the backlash was so great that it was this incident that they decided to forever separate the selection committee from members of the Norwegian government. So after this period of time, people who were on the Nobel Committee were no longer in these positions of government. And since that time, what we've seen is a gradual transformation of the Nobel Peace Prize from this instrument being used by the Norwegian government very strategically in how it was awarding the prize to one that's become a much more independent process. And while the belief systems of the Nobel Committee certainly reflect Norway, it is a much more independent body than it was at its beginning, and this started to happen in 1935. And so since that time, if you start going and looking at the lists of laureates, right, you'll start to see more people who challenged governments. So for example, in the 1960s, you saw, in 1960, you saw Albert Lutuli, the president of the African National Congress, receive the prize as a rebuke to South African apartheid. The same thing with Desmond Tutu in 1984. When Martin Luther King received the prize in 1964, right, that was clearly a statement that segregation in the United States was a human rights violation and immoral act. Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear physicist and Soviet dissident in 1975, received the prize. Walesa, the Polish trade union leader, he also received the prize. We saw Adolfo Perez Esquivel from Argentina receive the prize as a challenge to the military junta in Argentina. The Dalai Lama received the prize as a rebuke to China's policy. When Jimmy Carter received the prize in 2002, the Nobel Committee specifically said that it was giving this prize to Carter to highlight how bad they thought George W. Bush's foreign policy was. The Nobel Committee chairman said this should be interpreted as a criticism of the line that the current administration has taken. He was not beating around the bush. In 2003, Shireen Ebadi was given the prize to highlight human rights abuses in Iran. And in 2010, Liu Xiaobo in China received the prize as another criticism of the Chinese government, which actually did have negative ramifications for Norway. China put some economic restrictions on Norway after that happened. Now, another sort of controversial prize, I put Yasser Arafat up just simply as an example that you could do a whole list of people who fall into this category, are those groups of people who were fighting wars. They were war leaders on one level or another, and then came to a peaceful negotiation with their enemies, and the Nobel Committee has worked to honor that commitment towards peace, the changing your views away from the position of war to a position of peace. Now, oftentimes this is where the Nobel Committee gets most criticized, is these types of awards. But if we go back to that quote at the beginning of the talk, where Nobel was, he was the creator of munitions of war, and he moved away from that position, I actually think these awards are very fitting to say that we can all change where our position is. We could have fought wars, but we don't always fight wars. We could step back and we can create peace and we can change our ways. And so I think there is a place for these awards, as controversial as they sometimes may be. Now, another type of award that is often to what we call civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations who are working to promote a norm. A good example of this is the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. This was a large-based coalition to work on a landmine treaty, to get a landmine treaty passed that would make illegal the use of landmines during wartime. And this effort was awarded in 1997 when the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, along with Jody Williams, received the Nobel Peace Prize. The international, Bill Durston did show up, I saw him come in, and so the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War is another example of that. The Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, Amnesty International. We just had an instance where two Nobel laureates were, one was apologizing to the other one just yesterday, Barack Obama, who did win the Nobel Peace Prize, which we'll talk about in a little bit, had to call Doctors Without Borders to apologize for bombing their hospital. But the Doctors Without Borders also did receive a Nobel Peace Prize. I don't think I've seen in any news account of that conversation that it was two new Nobel Peace Prize laureates on the phone with each other. But let's talk a little bit about Obama, because one of the things I always joke about when people complain about Obama getting the Nobel Peace Prize, which I think there might be some legitimate complaints about his selection, but I always ask who won the prize in the year before, and I've never known anyone to know the answer, and sometimes I have to go back and look it up. Ahtisaari, who was a Finnish diplomat who was responsible for a number of negotiations and peace negotiations, had won the Nobel Peace Prize the year before. And this is a little Google Trends chart of people who search for Nobel Peace Prize, and you can see what effect Obama receiving the Nobel Peace Prize had. Never before has any Peace Prize generated so much interest. You know, why did Barack Obama win the Nobel Peace Prize? Well, there is an explanation for it. There's one, I think, is partly the Roosevelt effect, right? The Nobel Committee was trying to influence a young president. It's his first year in the presidency, and they felt that by giving him this honor, that perhaps it would encourage him to work more readily towards disarmament issues. And if you recall, the year prior to him receiving the Peace Prize, as President of the United States, he called for a nuclear weapons-free world. And no other president has actually made that. And that's a very important issue for the Nobel Committee. So it's not completely out of thin air that they would want to honor that declaration of a U.S. president announcing a nuclear weapons-free world. Now, I think probably, in retrospect, the Nobel Committee feels like it possibly backlashed a little bit, that it put too much focus, too much attention on a young president, that he then felt that he had to step back from some of these issues to avoid some of the criticism. But it was a selection that made a lot of impact. And if you see each of those little bumps here, these are Nobel Peace Prize bumps. Al Gore winning in 2007, that was also a fairly large bump, but nowhere near Obama winning the Peace Prize in 2009. But it also can put pressure on the government. And so just playing around, I found this one as well. 2011, what country's search engines is this measuring? Yeah, this is Liu Xiaobo won the Peace Prize in 2011, so I looked and wondered, well, how interested is China in the Nobel Peace Prize? Well, they were really interested in it in 2011, and so this is one bit of evidence that the awarding of a Nobel Peace Prize did generate, at least through Google searches, right, more interest in that specific country where the dissident was being honored about this Peace Prize. Who were these people who were awarding this Peace Prize for this specific dissident? So I know you all came here for this prediction, and I've been, piddling around, getting to it, trying to talk about a little history, right? So let's just talk about how this decision is made. So if you're trying to make a prediction, one thing you have to think through is what's the timeline in which decisions are going to happen. Now, in September, invitations are sent out. So last September, letters were sent out for people to nominate people for the Nobel Peace Prize. I believe this year I saw somewhere around 275 nominations came in. So a lot of people are nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Oftentimes you'll hear people say, I was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. That's true, but a lot of people are nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the committee ever thought that they were a reasonable selection for the Nobel Peace Prize. Nomination doesn't necessarily mean anything. I think Adolf Hitler was once nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. They announce it 50 years later. So you can go back now and see nominations up to 1964. And I believe Stalin was nominated at someone, so take nomination with a grain of salt. In February is the deadline for submissions. And as you're looking through this timeline, think about things that have been happening in the world during the past year during these times. So for submissions to be coming in, right, you're really looking at things that were happening pre-February 2015. Then they start to put together the short list in February to March. March through August, you start to see the advisor reviews. And then October, they make the announcement. They'll make the announcement tomorrow morning. So it's this long, year-long process. And so oftentimes, a current event that you think, well, this has to get the Nobel Peace Prize, won't get the Nobel Peace Prize because there's already been a long process taking place and the selection's been solidified. Now, there's a counterexample to this, though. 2 years ago, when the OPCW, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, received the Nobel Peace Prize, it was September that they played a major role in getting Syria and the Assad government to get rid of their chemical weapons. So that meant that they were making a very last-minute choice to reflect what was happening the month prior. So when we're thinking about who will receive the prize, we want to think about what's been happening this past year, who's been involved, and also what type of person or organization the Nobel Committee is going to want to support, right? I always see Snowden being, said, oh, he might win the Nobel Peace Prize. Snowden will never win the Nobel Peace Prize. Norway and the Norwegian committee, Nobel Committee, I don't see that type of dissident actor to be the type of dissident actor that they would honor with a Nobel Peace Prize. So a lot of times you see names that emerge and you think maybe they should. I don't know. I'll make no judgment on that, but they're not. It's just not going to be in the realm of the type of people who win that Nobel Peace Prize. So this year, right, this is exciting. I actually get ready for some PowerPoint effects, right? So this year, what were the major issues affecting the world? Yes? The migrant crisis, right? The migrant crisis was basically the news event of the world this year, I think. And so in terms of thinking about the prize, I think it's going to have something to do with what's happening with displaced persons throughout the world. Now, my first indication, right, my first thought was maybe the UNHCR, but they've already received the Nobel Peace Prize twice. They're one of 2 organizations that have won the Nobel Peace Prize multiple times. My second thought was maybe it would be an individual. Well, there's a lot of individuals that you can highlight who are working very strong, working on migration issues. No one really stands out as a real obvious choice in that regard. The third thought, it could be a civil society organization. The Norwegian Refugee Council, right, is one of the major NGO actors on refugee policy. And Norway actually has a long history of supporting and working on refugee issues, but only twice has a Norwegian ever been honored with the Nobel Peace Prize. They don't actually like to give the Nobel Peace Prize to Norwegians or organizations that work with Norway. And actually one of the Norwegian recipients, was a Norwegian who worked on refugee issues. So that leaves international organizations. And I think tomorrow's announcement is going to honor, are you ready? The International Organization for Migration. This is a UN agency, not very well known, but its mission, its goal, is to work for the humane and orderly migration of human beings. That migration happens, and so this international governmental organization based out of the United Nations works to make sure that legal paperwork is reasonable, that it assists in sort of the operational challenges of migration. They are very engaged on the ground with the crisis that's been happening throughout the Middle East and also in Europe, whereas the UNHCR, its purpose is its purpose is for refugee protection. The IOM has this important role in terms of easing and helping in the processes of migration, and to really help the world, state governments, people working on migration issues, to really understand migration issues and how to best approach these issues. I think tomorrow's announcement is going to be one of those announcements that highlights an organization that's not well known, but has a very important role in a current crisis. And I'll probably be wrong. That's just my caveat. But if I'm right, you're going to really think I'm awesome. So, I meant to actually hand out these 3x5 cards, which I found in our government department earlier today, to make your own predictions. But we'll do that next year. But if you have other thoughts of who might win, what's that?
I can have it up for you.
Okay.
Why wait?
Why wait? Here, make your predictions, write your name on them, and your email, and your prediction, and you can't predict IOM. And if you're right, we'll announce it.
Immigrate them into the Native American nations.
Okay. And also, just on other note with IOM, is that the ambassador of the director general of IOM is an American, William Lacey Swing, who would then be probably the speaker at the Nobel ceremony, which will take place in December. So we have some time for questions, and if you have any predictions that you want to boldly make, we can entertain that, but I'm free to answer questions as well. So any questions? Yeah.
Have they ever given the prize to a prominent religious leader, such as like Pope?
Well, Mother Teresa received the prize, and yes, one pope did receive the prize. I printed out a cheat sheet very early on. Oh, yes. He wondered if any religious leader has received the prize, and like the Pope. And just off the top of my head, obviously Mother Teresa comes to mind. But there have actually been quite a few people who have been, who've used their position as a religious leader to promote peace. Martin Luther King certainly was a religious leader. I'm trying to think of others that pop up. Desmond Tutu, yeah. The Dalai Lama, obviously. Yes. Yes, Esther.
You didn't name the American woman that won the first Nobel Peace Prize.
Who is it?
Pardon?
Who is it?
Jane Addams.
Jane Addams, yes.
She was the head of the organization that's the oldest peace organization, and they should win the prize because they're 100 years old today.
Oh, that would be a good one. So, yes, it's someday I'm going to dedicate to memory every prize winner in every year. But until then, but that's a good one. Only 16 women have ever received the Nobel Peace Prize, which is kind of a stain on the Nobel Committee's record in many ways, and with the number of activist women who have worked for peace, that it's so rare that they've been honored with what's considered the highest award for peace work. Other questions, other predictions?
Legalize polygamy.
What's that?
Legalize polygamy, and you can marry people over.
I don't even understand that at all. Okay. Other questions? Yeah. Nancy.
Whatever happened to the German journalist?
He died in prison. Yeah, he was released and then rearrested. I believe he was released, and then he was rearrested and he died in prison. I mean, the accounts of someone had gone and visited him prior to him receiving the prize, and just the description of he was beat, his leg was broken, he has clearly been tortured, clearly beaten, it's a really, if you're looking for a really interesting sort of history of that time, von Ositsky is a really interesting case, and that prize itself also represents the importance of lobbying for the prize, and one of the things that often comes up is how much lobbying takes place for any given prize, and if you sometimes to a controversial level. I know there have been issues for some prizes where people felt like they were slighted because one person in a movement received recognition over another. And so sometimes when you're going and looking at the history of the prizes and reading about reactions to the prize, you'll often come across sort of those types of narratives, that this person only won the prize because they had a better lobbying side. And I the Nobel Committee will always say, well, that's not true, but it is a political prize, and I think it's important to recognize that. It's not just this award that kind of comes down from heaven, but there's a political process, a strategic process behind the awarding of the prize on any given year. Yeah, Ryan.
One that I was thinking about, she's just been in news for the past few years, but when they're making the selection, I don't know if it was really that prominent, Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
Potentially, but I don't know if she really was making the news in the recent months.
Yeah, the reason why I don't think Merkel will receive the Nobel Peace Prize is because the European Union won. It was in 2012. And she was essentially, during that prize ceremony, she was sort of the key head figure that was at the prize ceremony. So even though she didn't receive the Nobel Peace Prize as an individual, she's really kind of right now in the past few years been the face of the European Union, which just won the Nobel Peace Prize. And while some of her statements regarding the migration crisis have been key in terms of getting other European states to open up their borders more so, I don't think the level of that she's been advocating for opening up their borders would be enough to merit giving a Nobel Peace Prize to her over organizations, individuals, and other people who have been fighting this and working on these issues on a much deeper level. And so I think, I've seen her name around quite a bit, but I don't think she will be given the Peace Prize. I've seen Pope Francis come up as a possibility. Yeah.
I'm just trying to remember when did Obama receive the Peace Prize and what category?
He won in 2009, and I would have to actually go back to the website to see where they categorize that, but I'm going to say they put it in disarmament, because that was what they were recognizing with the prize. was his call for a nuclear weapon-free world. And if you go back to the arms control organizations that have won the Nobel Peace Prize, those organizations have called for complete and total nuclear disarmament. They're not organizations that are calling for reductions or, but they're organizations that are calling for a nuclear weapons-free world, which is something that the Nobel Committee has consistently recognized as one of their values. If the migration crisis, though, hadn't been happening this year, I would have said it would have been a nuclear weapons arms control group, because they do it on the fives. So in 2005, it was the International Atomic Energy Agency. In 1995 is the Pugwash Conference of Science and World Affairs. 1985, it was the International Physicians. I always want to say Physicians for Social Responsibility, for International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, right? And so, so the pattern is going to break this year. It's a random pattern, but yeah.
Along those lines, one possible organization, I'm not sure, it's been news organization called International Congress for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, and held a conference in Brussels,
Yeah.
either December of last year. Basically, I think like 176 countries were basically unhappy with lack of progress on the 1970 nuclear
Proliferation Treaty.
and so they committed to work outside of UN for nuclear abolition. There's something called the Austrian Pledge.
Okay.
ICAN will be my.
So that's your guess, Bill, is ICAN. Do you want to explain quickly what ICAN, because that's up there. I think they could. In any other given year, I think ICAN will probably win the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't think this year, but I think that would be a safe bet. Do you want to say what that is?
What ICAN?
Yeah.
It's just, as I said, the affiliation of, I think, 176 countries that basically say, enough fiddling around. We're not making progress on the nuclear
Oh.
treaty back.
I was thinking the International Civil Society Action Network.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. They have the same acronym. There's a civil society network that has been very engaged in trying to get civil society organizations on the ground in all over the world, but also mostly in war-torn societies and they've been playing a major role in kind of peace processes and things like that. So yeah. All right, same acronym. Okay. Yeah.
Well, going back to President Obama and the Nobel Prize, some of us were, including myself, disappointed the way he was somewhat muted in accepting it.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it was too political, too early.
Yeah.
But I wonder, as years have gone by, and given some of his somewhat less bellicose temper approach with regard to the war and the U.S. involvement, militarily speaking, the recent nuclear deal with Iran, and so on and so forth, call it peace moves. To what extent that prize may have, in fact, informed his approach to U.S. foreign policy with regard to less use of military force?
That's a good question. Whether or not him being a Nobel Peace Prize laureate may have constrained him in some ways. I better
earn it now. He's not very fast.
I better earn it now. I mean, when he received the prize, the White House actually called and asked if it was possible, if he had to come to the ceremony. He didn't, and so he flew in and out very quickly. He really didn't like the attention that it gave him. He was clearly not comfortable with the announcement. And just so you know, when the prize, if one of you in this room may be a Nobel Peace Prize laureate tomorrow, you wouldn't know. The way that you find out is that the Nobel Committee calls you and says, in 30 minutes, we're going to announce that you're the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Will you accept this? You have 30 minutes to gather your thoughts. That was one of my favorite insights, being able to spend time with Joseph Rotblat when he was talking about getting the phone call in the morning and not expecting it. He's 87 years old. I don't think he had any expectation that he might be named the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And so what he did is he went for a walk, a very fast walk, and then in 30 minutes, his life was about to change. And he was then going to spend the rest of his life as a Nobel laureate. And at 87 years old, you're probably thinking you can probably slow down. And he spent the last years of his life tirelessly using his stature as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate to argue for a nuclear weapons-free world. And one of the most amazing things about being involved with that organization at that time was he never said no to coming out and meeting with young people, giving talks, just anything he could do using his stature as a Nobel laureate to be able to talk about peace and to be able to talk about nuclear disarmament. He would take that opportunity. And he actually reused this phrase that I always appreciated. There's the Latin "si vis pacem para bellum," which means if you want peace, prepare for war. And he changed that. He actually someone else had done this, but he used it all the time, where he said "si vis pacem para pacem," which is Latin for if you want peace, prepare for peace. And so since hearing that from him, I've always felt like that is the more sensible approach to creating a peaceful world, that if you want peace, you actually have to do the things that create peace. There's no other way about it. And so he really promoted that message after that prize. And so you've seen a number of laureates who have really used the Nobel Peace Prize as a way to become stronger activists. And I think the Nobel Committee really values that when a Nobel laureate does that. Malala, right, I think is a good example of someone who will, she received the prize at 17 years old. And she has not shied away from being the activist and standing up to that role. And I think the Nobel Committee was very worried about giving the prize to someone so young. And she is having I guess that documentary is coming out tomorrow. There's a new documentary on Malala, and my wife was joking that I was bawling just through the preview. So, but she's someone who I can see going forward for years and years and years using the Nobel Peace Prize as a way to leverage her message for education for girls. Other questions or comments?
Has there been any case of recall?
No, there's never been a recall election on a Nobel Peace Prize. But Luc Doc Tho of Vietnam, he is the only person who rejected the prize. Because he and Kissinger didn't. Kissinger didn't go to the ceremony, but they had received the prize for negotiating an end to the Vietnam War, but the negotiation failed, and so he said, I don't want this prize. So, but in terms of a recall, no. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'd like to thank you all for coming out. It was a pleasure to have you here. And let's do it again next year.